Welcome to the Fantasy Formula One podcast. I'm Paul, and this is your 2025 driver bio and fantasy review. We're going to briefly discuss each of the drivers in the current lineup, where they come from, how they got here, and then we're going to go into their performance last year, fantasy-wise, and see what we can glean from that. Any big takeaways or considerations for when the formula gets released and we actually see how much each of the drivers cost and we start building our teams. Kicking it off with Max Verstappen. He was born in 1997. He's been racing 11 years in Formula One, 10 years with the current team Red Bull. He holds a record for most sprint victories, current reigning four-time world champion. He was the youngest driver to start an F1 race at 17 years, 166 days. He was the youngest driver to win a Formula One race at 18 years, 228 days. And he holds a record for the most wins in a single Formula One season with 19 victories, set back in 2023. And he has the longest consecutive race win streak with 10 straight victories. His fantasy performance has been just as dominant. For last year, his end-of-the-year cost was over $32 million, which put him about $5 million over number 2, Lando Norris. He had topped the leader charts with 754 fantasy points. Just to put that in perspective, he was number 1 with 754. It went down to number 8 was George Russell at 455. Then Sergio Perez with 319. Fernando Alonso with 173. Then Jogan Yu at 105 at number 11. And then Esteban Ocon at number 12 with 105 as well. So Max Verstappen had, almost 7 times the points of number 10 and 12. So it was very, very, very dominant. And last year with the fantasy formula, it ended up being very skewed towards the top 10, which makes sense because the top 10 is where all your points are. Ben Max Verstappen was at the top of that by 60 points. He averaged over 30 points a race. He didn't have much of a value change, only $2.3 million, because he came into it as a 3-time world champion last year. He came into it so expensive. He had 73 overtakes, 14 podiums, 23 top 10 finishes, and only 1 DNF. And there were only 24 races last year. So 23 plus 1, there's your 24. He basically either DNF'd or he finished in the top 10. So what to look at him for this year? Well, towards the end of last year, Red Bull car dropped off. They weren't quite as fast of a constructor as they were at the start of the season, or depending on how you look at it, McLaren and Ferrari had just caught up with them. I personally think that if there had been a few more races, Lando Norris would have overtaken Max Verstappen well. But the reason why Max Verstappen is still the world champion is because he's that good of a driver, and he's able to get more out of the Red Bull car last year than it really should have been able to do, because Sergio Perez wasn't able to get nearly as much out of it. What to watch for this year is for Max Verstappen's cost. As soon as he comes in, he costs a quarter to 40% of your budget. I don't see it being worth keeping him on your roster. That's just too much money, and other drivers like Leclerc and Norris and Sainz and Piastri, Hamilton, it'd be much better to split up that money around them and get more drivers that can get you a little bit less points, but still solid points. And that brings us to his new teammates, Liam Lawson. This is his first full season in Formula One. He came into Formula One in 2023 when Daniel Ricciardo crashed and broke his hand. And he did pretty well. He got more out of the car or at least as much out of the car as Ricciardo got. Gave the seat back to Ricciardo, fine. The next year, he was a reserve driver. And when Daniel Ricciardo lost his seat unceremoniously halfway through the season, Liam Lawson took over and raced the rest of the season. And now he got promoted to Red Bull Racing. So that's really great for him. Again, unceremoniously replaced Sergio Perez. As far as accolades, he's been a member of the Red Bull Junior team since 2019. He got third place in 2022 Formula 2 Championship and runner-up in the 2023 Super Formula Championship. So the guy knows how to drive. He wouldn't be in the seat if he didn't. Looking at his stats from last year, he came in at around $10 million, didn't improve much just because it was so late in the season. And he got 35 overtakes, which equated to his 35 points. Will he do great things in Red Bull? I think he will. I think it depends on how good the car is in general this year. The big thing with Red Bull is the price. As soon as Red Bull comes in and Liam Lawson is valued at $30 million, then that's a big question. That's a gamble, because as soon as he's valued low and he does well, his price is going to skyrocket. As soon as he comes in at a high value and does well, then it'll be worth it. And speaking of Red Bull as a constructor, how'd they do last year? Well, they topped the season at having a value of about $30 million at the end, which wasn't much of an increase. Most of the constructors only went up, 5 or 6 million tops, and Red Bull went up 1.2. They averaged just under 60 points a race, which is huge. They were only beat out by McLaren that averaged just under 63. And they were comparable to Ferrari that finished off at 58.9, because Red Bull finished off at 59.2. Moving on to Mercedes, George Russell is now the lead driver at Mercedes. He's entering his 7th season in Formula One. He has 3 race wins, and he has a total of 15 podium finishes as of the end of the 2024 season. Why do I emphasize that he's a lead driver now? Well, it used to be Lewis Hamilton, the multiple world champion, and we'll get to him in a little bit. But Lewis Hamilton went on to Ferrari now. So now George Russell is the lead driver at Mercedes, and he has his sights set on Max Verstappen. We can expect that to be in the forefront of George Russell's media coverage. How about that? How did he do last year fantasy-wise? Well, how did he do last year fantasy-wise? Well, he finished off at 23.2 million. He had 455 fantasy points. So significantly under Max Verstappen, but he still put up, around 19 points a race weekend, I should say. His total cost change was a little over $4 million. He had 88 overtakes, 4 podiums, 21 top 10 finishes, and only 1 DNF. And that is the wonderful thing about George Russell as a driver, is he didn't crash much last year. Everybody gets a DNF at least once a season. They just do. And he only had his 1. He didn't go to 2 or 3 or 4, or as we'll hear later on, 6. But whether or not to put Mercedes as your constructor comes down to the second driver as well. Mercedes' second driver is Kimi Antonelli. He's a rookie this year. He was born in 2006. He got 6th in the 2024 Formula 2 championship. And he took Lewis Hamilton's spot on Mercedes when Lewis Hamilton went to Ferrari. We don't have any fantasy stats about Kimi, since this is his first season. But things to look out for is during the free practice of race 1, look to see how close Kimi Antonelli can keep up with George. And the reason why is, in theory, these cars, they're made by the same company, right? They're the same part, same team, same everything. They should be capable of racing neck and neck. As soon as there's a big split between George or between any lead driver and the second driver, then you have to look at the driver's skill. And as soon as, for fantasy purposes, George does really well, and Kimi is doing well, but he just exceeds track limits or has some issues or whatever, then if his value is good, then you want to get him and ride that wave up on your fantasy team. As soon as there's more of a 2024 Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez sort of vibe, then you might not want to have Kimi Antonelli. But again, and you're going to hear me say this entire episode, it all comes down to the money. But what about the Mercedes constructor? Again, end-of-year cost was $25 million, so a quarter of your budget. They average 47 fantasy points a race, which is good, right? It's just a little off of Ferrari and McLaren and Red Bull. They had 212 overtakes, 9 podiums, 42 top 10 finishes, and only 3 DNFs across the team. And Mercedes' reserve driver this year is Valtteri Bottas. You might recognize him from his time with Kick Sauber over the last 2 years, Alfa Romeo / Kick Sauber over the last 2 years. He's been racing for 28 years. And the interesting thing about Valtteri Bottas is that he has 10 race wins. All of them with Mercedes, because he was with Mercedes from 2017 to 2021, where he secured 20 pole positions and 67 podium finishes. And during the time he was there, 2017 and 2021, he contributed to Mercedes 5 consecutive Constructors' Championships. And in 2019, 2020, he got second in the Drivers' Championship. So this guy can drive. He knows his stuff, and he is good. He just got put with Kick Sauber, and it just wasn't quite working out. If he's able to get some time in his seat, then I think he'd do really good things in a Mercedes. His value at the end of the year last year was only $7 million. He had 46 fantasy points. Charles Leclerc, he's been racing for about 20 years. This is his 8th season, his 7th season with Ferrari. He has 16 wins, 25 pole positions, and 45 podium finishes. So dominant driver. He just happens to have done most of this in the era where Max Verstappen was pretty much untouchable. How did he do last year? Well, his value came in at $26.1 million at the end of the year, 684 fantasy points. He averaged 28.5 per race, which is just a few off of Max Verstappen and Lando Norris. His value changed $7 million, so he was undervalued at the beginning of the season, and they tried to adjust it. 93 overtakes, 13 podiums, 21 top 10 finishes, and again, only 1 DNF, 3 fastest laps, and 5 driver of the days, which again, haven't looked at the fantasy formula yet because it's not released, but that matters. And then Lewis Hamilton, his new teammate, has been driving for about 30 years. This is his 19th season in Formula One and his first year with Ferrari. So, a little bit of the background about that drama. He was with Mercedes from 2013 to 2024. He has 103 wins. And he's a 7-time Formula One Drivers' Champion. He got the Drivers' Championship in 2008 when he was with McLaren. Then he got it after he joined Mercedes. He got it in 14, 15, 17, 18, 19, and 20. So this guy's good. But what happened in 20? Well, arguably it just stopped working for him because 2021 was a little bit of an asterisk, because it did seem a little artificial how they decided the Drivers' Championship. He and Max Verstappen were neck and neck, and it came down to the last lap of the last race. They basically they had a red flag or they had a caution. I forget how it worked, but it ended up being a 1-lap drag race between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen to decide the World Championship. So a lot of people still believe that he should have won in 2021. But no, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's how it rolled. But he's never won since, probably because that was the start of the era of Max Verstappen's dominance. But also, Mercedes did take a wrong direction one of those years with their engineering and their construction, and set him a year behind. That's not my analysis. That's F1.com's analysis. So they're fighting back, but it just never quite worked out. And then he decided to go to Ferrari, which that's a whole nother conversation in and of itself. How did he do last year, though? His value, again, 25.8, right there neck and neck, 495 fantasy points. So he's right up there with Piastri, Sainz, Russell. A little over 20 points a race. Not bad. Cost change of $6.5 million. Again, so his value improved as the season went on, which most of them do. 124 overtakes, 5 podiums, 21 top 10 finishes, 2 DNFs, 2 fastest laps, and 3 driver of the day. So he did do solid performance. Again, so especially with Hamilton and a Ferrari, no one knows what that's going to look like. So keep an eye out for it. And it comes down to value. There's 2 teams that I feel if you could get their entire lineup on your roster, that would be huge. One of them is Ferrari. If you could get Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, and the Ferrari constructor all on your team, I think and still be able to field a full team with a good second constructor, that would be a huge coup. But the point's still made that as soon as you can get Ferrari as your main backbone for a team, again, without looking at the formula, without looking at the cost, I think that would be a positive move. At least that's the move I'm looking to make. The reserve drivers this year for Ferrari are some names you probably recognize. Zhou Guanyu, who used to drive for Kick Sauber, he's now a reserve driver for Ferrari. And so is Antonio Giovinetti. Probably goofing up your name, sorry. An interesting little tidbit about Antonio is that he won the 2023 24 Hours at Le Mans in the hypercar, which is pretty cool. On to McLaren. Kicking that off with Lando Norris. He's been racing for 19 years. This is his 7th year in Formula One, and he spent the entire time with McLaren. He finished number 2 in the 2024 Drivers' Championship, barely behind Max Verstappen, and I am of the ilk that if there had been another 2 or 3 races with the way Red Bull had been dropping off and with how well McLaren had been doing, he could have passed Max Verstappen with there. And McLaren did win the Constructors' Championship, excuse me. So very, very dominant performance. How dominant? Well, let's take a look at the numbers. $27.5 million is his cost. He had 695 fantasy points. So maybe I think it was like 59 points behind Max Verstappen. Averaged 28.96 a race, again, less than 2 behind Max Verstappen. Cost change was 4.5, so there was a little bit of adjustment there. He had 55 overtakes, 13 podiums, 23 top 10 finishes, and no DNFs, which is huge. 23 out of the 24 races, he was getting points. 13 of those races, he was on the podium. Oscar Piastri has been racing for 17 years. This is his third season in Formula One, again with McLaren. And he already has 2 race wins. Oscar Piastri has 2 race wins. And again, very, very strong performances. Not quite to where Lando Norris is, but they're enough that he's making stuff happen. How do you do fantasy-wise? Well, again, only maybe $1 million or $2 million off of Lando Norris at 25.7. He had 584 points. So yeah, 100 points, 100 fantasy points off of Charles Leclerc and a little over 100 points off of his teammate, but he still averaged 24.3 points per race. His cost change was $6.7 million, so there was a lot of adjustment going on there as the season went. He had 106 overtakes, 8 podiums, again, 23 top 10 finishes. So if you can get him and Lando Norris and the McLaren constructor all on one team, they're the second one, that would be a coup. A McLaren-based team would be wonderful. I don't think that's going to be possible because my guess is F1 knows that they're that dominant and they're going to cost prohibit that, and we'll go into a whole nother discussion once their actual formula comes out. But McLaren, they ended their last year's value topped at $27 million. They averaged 62.75 fantasy points a race. That was the best, the top. Would Red Bull have done better if they had 2 drivers that were putting up consistent fantasy points? Absolutely. But Sergio Perez was a little bit of a liability fantasy-wise last year. Otherwise, Red Bull would have done better. As a team, McLaren had 161 overtakes, 21 podiums, and 46 top 10 finishes, and 0 DNFs. So there you go. That's it. That right there is the pedigree of McLaren. If you can get all of McLaren on your team and one other solid constructor, think Ferrari, think Mercedes, doesn't really matter what else you have. That, again, without looking at the formula and just looking at last year, that is the best possible team right now. McLaren is not without their own reserve driver as well. Pat O'Ward is their reserve driver. It's his second year there. He's never really raced in Formula One as long enough to get any sort of fantasy stats on him. That takes us to Aston Martin. Fernando Alonso has been racing for 35 years. He's their lead driver. He's entering his 22nd season Formula One. Yep, he raced with Minardi, Renault, McLaren, Ferrari, Alpine, and he has 32 race wins. He is a 2-time Formula One World Drivers' Champion, 2005 and 2006. As far as fantasy points go, nothing too great, but also because you're in the age of Max Verstappen, right? He has his value was $15 million at the end of the year. He had 173 fantasy points, which if you look at it, you think, well, no less, half of George Russell, half of Lewis Hamilton, but it's also almost twice as much as P13 of Magnussen, of Pierre Gasly, Lance Stroll, all of that. So he's right there in the middle of the pack. He has 88 overtakes, 14 top 10 finishes, and only 1 DNF and 2 fastest laps. So he's a great driver to get if you can afford him. However, the issue with him as a fantasy driver for last year is that as soon as you can afford Fernando Alonso, well, then you could go ahead and afford Nico Hülkenberg and take that extra money and be able to bump up into like another driver into the Charles Leclerc, Oscar Piastri range. That's the issue with where he was priced at last year. His teammate, Lance Stroll, has been racing for about 20 years. This is his 9th season in Formula One. And the big controversy around him, he's a fine driver, but the big controversy around him is his dad owns the team. So would he be driving if his dad didn't own the team? Or if his dad was looking at him coldly and objectively, would they have the lineup they have now? I don't know. But they have, for some of the with the pedigree of Fernando Alonso, and Lance Stroll isn't finishing at the back of the pack. So he is doing well, and the constructor's doing well. It just doesn't translate too well into fantasy points. Again, his value at the end of the year was $14.3 million. He had 87 points. Not bad. He had 120 overtakes, 6 top 10 finishes, and 3 DNFs, which hurt. So that's the line with Aston Martin is not that they're bad. They just, as soon as you can afford them, there's better people, cheaper, and you can put more money somewhere else. Aston Martin's reserve driver is Felipe Drogovic, and he was the Formula 2 champion in 2022 and has been with Aston Martin ever since as their reserve driver. So yeah, no fantasy stats on him. Their other 2 reserve drivers is, and I apologize, I'm going to goof this name up, Stoffel Vandoorne. Sorry, dude. But he's been their reserve driver as well, and so is, man. Aston Martin has 3 reserve drivers, Felipe Drogovic, Stoffel Vandoorne, and Jack Crawford. So they do have a pretty diverse bullpen to choose from. I know Drogovic was a Formula 2 champion. Vandoorne scored points Vandoorne scored points in Formula 1 before. So there's lots of good talent there for them to both glean from in the off season, and if in case something happens to one of the drivers, for them to actually put in the seat. Moving on to Pierre Gasly. Moving on to Alpine. Pierre Gasly as their lead driver. This is his 9th season in Formula 1, and he is one of the love-hate fantasy drivers, at least in my opinion. And he's one of the love-hate drivers, at least in my opinion, because his value is at $11 million. Okay, got it. 10% of your budget, a little over. And he put up 92 points, which is good. And he got 90 overtakes, 1 podium, and 9 top 10 finishes. But he had 4 DNFs. And I know a lot of that comes from just Alpine itself last year. But you're going to see that trend with some of these middle-tier fantasy teams, is that the issue with them is not that they don't put up fair points for their numbers. They just DNF a lot. And at least in the 2024 formula, and you're going to see us with a lot of these mid-ranked teams in fantasy, at least, is not that they don't put up points. It's just they just crash. And as soon as they DNF, at least in the 2024 formula, there were the massive penalties, and that made them not worth it. But this year might be a little different because they also have Jack Doan as their second driver. He's been racing for 13 years. This is his first full season in F1. But he's been with Alpine for 3 years, and he joined as a reserve driver in 2023. Don't have any stats on him fantasy-wise, but it does show that the team's changing, and who knows what's going to go on this year. But the hard part for me is Alpine as a constructors. The hard part for me is Alpine as a constructors cost. So they're at $12 million. They averaged 13 fantasy points a race. And sure, their points per million was a little over 1, which was strong, but their cost is only 12, so they just weren't putting up that much. They had 195 overtakes, 2 podiums, and 14 top 10 finishes, but 6 DNFs, which is way too much. So if, even as a filler team, I'm really soft on Alpine, I would go with a V-carb. I would go with Haas before I put Alpine on my fantasy team. That being said, as soon as Jack or Pierre, come out of the chute and start knocking on the door of the top 10 and is consistent, and Alpine seems to have eliminated a lot of their mechanical issues, then yeah, that could work. Alpine's backup driver is Franco Colapinto. You will remember him from last year when he replaced my countryman Logan Sargent. So we have some fantasy stats for him. We have some fantasy stats for him. He ended the year with 7 fantasy points. He was in the positive, and there's a little bit about how last year's formula changed, but I'm not going to worry about that. He had 36 overtakes, 2 top 10 finishes, and 3 DNFs. And again, the DNFs is what got him. But again, my countryman was struggling so much that from a fantasy perspective, it really didn't impact. And I put Franco Colapinto on my team for a little bit, and it just, those DNFs really got to us. Got to me as a fantasy player, I should say. There are other There are other reserve drivers on the Alpine team. I'm gonna mess this name up, and I apologize in advance. Ryu Harikawa is one of the reserve drivers, and so is Paul Aaron. Paul Aaron is a veteran of Formula 2, where he achieved 7 podium finishes and 4 pole positions. And Harikawa was the winner of the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 2022 and a 2-time FIA World Endurance Champion. So in 22 and 23. So there's a good pedigree there. And if for some reason Alpine ever needs another driver, they have plenty waiting in the wings. On to Williams. Alexander Albon is the lead driver in Williams. He's entering his 7th season in Formula One, his 4th season with Williams. And he did sign a multi-year contract to take him into the new Formula era starting in 2026. So he's in it to win it right now. He's not going anywhere. As far as his fantasy performance went last year, it was pretty abysmal. He had 99 overtakes, 4 top 10 finishes, and 7 DNFs. Enough said with that. And this is probably one of the ways that fantasy doesn't reflect reality, where Alex Albon is joined by Carlos Sainz this year, who has been racing for 24 years-ish. He's entering his 11th season. And you might recognize him as a guy who used to drive for Ferrari last year. He went wheel to wheel with his teammate quite a bit, but then they let him go to make room for Lewis Hamilton. So he shopped around a little bit and landed at Williams as, I would say, arguably the lead driver. Now, Williams did have mechanical issues. They had some supply line issues. But as soon as you can get Carlos Sainz on your team early for under $10 million, I would strongly consider it. He was a strong driver in Ferrari. I really think he can get a lot out of these Williams rides. The big question is if they're going to value him as a Williams driver or if they're going to value him as a him driver. And as soon as you value him to the way he was when he was racing Ferrari, well, then he's going to be driving a Williams and be cost prohibitive. So we'll see how that goes, I should say. But back when he was racing at Ferrari, his price topped out at $24.4 million. He had 504 fantasy points. Now, as soon as he gets half of those and he's for $7 million, well, then that's a bargain. It really is. So as soon as you can get Carlos Sainz Jr. for under $10 million, I'd strongly encourage you to do it. As far as Williams as a constructor, their price topped out at $6 million last year, $6.1 million. And they had 174 overtakes, 6 top 10 finishes, good for them, 10 DNFs. To put that in perspective, if they hadn't gotten those DNFs and just finished last every one of those races, they would have over doubled their fantasy score. So that's the huge issue with Williams as a constructor. I'd strongly advise against taking Williams as a constructor unless for some reason their guys not only are they not DNFing, but they are. But if Carlos Sainz is doing really, really well. Moving on to Racing Bulls. Yuki Tsunoda is the lead driver at the Racing Bulls this year. He arguably was last year as well. He is entering his 5th season in Formula One, his 2nd season with Racing Bulls. And he's a strong driver that just seems to always be just outside of the top 10 because you have your Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes, and McLaren sealing out 8 of those top 10s normally. And then you have everybody else competing for the last 2. So I firmly believe that's why he's not ranked higher. As soon as there's a race where for some reason magically McLaren or Red Bull doesn't race, then yeah, I think you see him in the top 10 a lot more often. As far as performance last year, it was about what you would expect for a driver that never makes it into the top 10. 11.9 million at the end of the year. He had 69 giggity fantasy points. He averaged 2.88 points per million, which is averaged 2.88 points per game, points per race, excuse me. Yuki Tsunoda, fantasy-wise, is about what you would expect for a driver who was never able to make it into the top 10 last year. His value was $11.9 million, which is an increase of $4 million over the season, so about average. His end-of-the-year fantasy points was 69, giggity, and his average fantasy points was 2.88, which, again, not bad. He had 204 overtakes, no podiums, 9 top 10 finishes. Again, not bad at all. But he had 4 DNFs, and that really hurt because 4 times 20 is 80, and when his end of the year points is 69 giggity, he lost basically around his full points, and he would have been twice that many points, which means if he had just gotten last and not crashed, he would have ranked 10th. So it's one of those situations in fantasy-wise where as soon as Yuki Tsunoda has everything together, he can do great things. But it just hasn't worked out yet. His teammate, Isaac Hadjar, is a rookie this year. He's been competing in French Formula 4. Isaac Hadjar began competing in French Formula 4 when he was 14. This is his first season in Formula 1, as I said. So we don't have any stats on him, but he joined Red Bull Junior Team in 2022, and he was a reserve driver for RB last year. So it's good that he got promoted up, and expect to see good things from him. Really do. And with him, since he's largely untried, as soon as he's turning out good lap times in practice, or as soon as he is priced to sell like $4.55 million, I wouldn't be against getting Isaac Hadjar on at least one of my fantasy teams just to see how well he does. Because as soon as he comes out of the chute and finishes in the top 10 past Yuki Tsunoda, that's very telling for the way this season is going to go. And it's best to buy him, get him on your team, I should say, when he before he starts winning, because his price will jump up $1 million a race as long as he's putting in the top 10. But how did RB do last year? Well, they finished out the year at $12 million. They averaged 12 fantasy points a race, which is not bueno. I should say a weekend, which is not good. How did RB fare last year in 2024? Well, their end of the year cost was $12 million. Their average points per weekend was 12. And they had 194 overtakes, 14 top 10 finishes, and 5 DNFs. Again, for those of you playing along at home, Ayumu Iwasa is Red Bull's reserve driver this year. Again, don't have any fantasy stats on him. He finished 4th in FIA Formula 2 Championship in 2023, and he won French Formula 4 Championship with 9 victories in 2020. So he has a racing pedigree, but we just don't have any fantasy numbers on him yet. Moving on to Kick Sauber. Nico Hülkenberg is their lead driver. He's been racing for about 30 years. This is his 12th season in Formula 1. And he won the 24 Hours at Le Mans in 2015 with Porsche. So the guy has a great driving pedigree. And he was one of my favorite drivers in Haas. Sorry, not one of my favorite drivers in Haas. He was one of my favorite drivers to have as like a rank and file fantasy driver because he cost $11 million, had 86 points, fine, which is fine. And he had 2 DNFs and 10 top 10 finishes. So he was a lot less of a liability than some of the other rank and file drivers, but in the end, you just have to balance his performance with his DNFs. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what he does at Kick Sauber, and he is also one of the drivers I'm definitely keeping an eye on. Depending on the price, would definitely make it worth having them on the team. His teammate this year at Kick Sauber is Gabriel Bortoleto. He won the 2024 Formula 2 Championship, and this is his rookie season in Formula 1. So I definitely think you should keep an eye on him. He's largely untried in a Formula 1 car, so he should come in, first off, because he's driving for Kick Sauber, but second off, because he, by and large, is untested. Keep an eye on him, and if you're looking for a gamble, I would put some money on Gabriel Bortoleto, because as soon as he does really well, his price is going to skyrocket, but because, like I said, with Gabriel Bortoleto, because he won the 2024 FIA Formula 2 Championship, it makes me think he's got some real chops. But he's racing for Kick Sauber, so I don't know if he's quite worth the fantasy risk. If you're looking for a little bit of risk in your portfolio, so to speak, I would say have him over Nico Hülkenberg, again, depending on the price, be one of your rank and file drivers. Because as soon as Gabriel just tries to keep it out of the wall and stays going straight, which he should since this is his rookie season, it'll be worth it just to have him not DNF. And as soon as he does push it and he does well, his price is going to skyrocket and he's going to get you points. But that all does depend on if they have their if Kick Sauber has their mechanical issues sorted by the time the green flag goes. How did Kick Sauber do last year? Well, they averaged their end of the year cost was $7.5 million, which was up $0.9 million. They had 1 top 10 finish and 4 DNFs. So they're a huge liability, which is why, again, there's part of they're one of the better gambles to put in your team, since they only had 4 DNFs between the twixt of the drivers all season. But really hope my hope would be that this team matchup between Hulkenberg and Bortoleto really works, and they're able to push towards that top 10. On to our last team, Haas. Esteban Ocon, this is his first year driving with Haas, but this is his 10th season in F1. If you remember last year, he was racing with Alpine, and they decided to, since he knew he was going to Haas the next year, they decided to let him go a race or two before the end and gave it to somebody else, which kind of stinks, but that's the way it works. And he did sign a multi-year contract when he went to Haas, so he's going to be there into the new era. And Esteban Ocon was one of the drivers last year that it seemed like every time I probably unfairly disliked him as a fantasy driver, because it seemed like every time I would get him on my team, he would DNF or something would go south. His end of the year cost was a little over $14 million. He had 105 fantasy points all year, which is good. 5 top 10 finishes, even got on a podium. But he had 3 DNFs. So again, he would have increased 60% of his points. If another 60% of his points would have been added if he had not DNF'd. But there you have it. And my problem was last year is that I had him on my team for all 3 of those DNFs. So I'm probably a little unfair, I get it, but I'm not a fan of Esteban Ocon as a fantasy driver. His teammate, however, Ollie Behrman, is a little bit of a different story. He's been racing for 12 years. It's his first year in F1 as a full-time driver, first year with Haas. And he substituted for Carlos Sainz at Ferrari during 2024 and finished 7th and earned the team points. He also stood in for Haas when Kevin Magnussen had a race ban in 2024 Brazil. So he knows how to drive these cars, and he was really impressive when he raced with Ferrari. And he competed in the FIA Formula 2 Championship in 2024, and he graduated Ferrari Academy. So he has a Ferrari pedigree. He's here at Haas, and it really just depends on if Haas gives him a good enough car, because he sat down in a Ferrari and did well. He sat down in Haas and did fine, but it really just depends on what kind of vehicle Haas brings this year and if it's something that Ollie Behrman can translate into reality. But even with those few... here you go. Well, that's the drivers and the bios and their fantasy performances last year. Keep an eye out for that. And that is the fantasy. Thank you for listening. Hope all that helped. And we will all keep our eyes out for the fantasy formula to be released. Well, I hope that was insightful and I hope it helped. Well, that's what we got. Well, I hope that was fun and that helped. Be sure to check out the rest of our content. Get caught up in all things Fantasy Formula 1 before the teams lock. Cheers.